Welcome to the TBC Podcast, where we talk about curious, thought-provoking, and sometimes controversial ideas through the lens of biblical wisdom. I'm Keith Wood, and today I'm joined by Matthew Hevner, who's the Vice President of Enrolment Management and Development here at Trinity Baptist College. Matt, thank you for being here.
Happy to be here.
So in addition to your role as Vice President, you also do work as a business professor. You teach a number of classes, correct?
That is correct, yeah.
So I also got the privilege of taking some classes with you as a student, and then we've worked on a variety of different things over the years. And I know that a topic that you're passionate about is this idea of value.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk to you about that today. And why don't we just jump right into it with a definition? What as you see it, is value?
Okay, well, value, and again, this is probably, I would argue it's a little bit more universal than just a business definition of value, but it is the benefits that one receives less the price and the hassle of acquiring that benefit. And so as a formula, it would be value as the difference of the benefit and the total cost. So if I was to explain that in a transaction, the easiest way to explain it would be like if you go to McDonald's, you have a certain expectation. You're looking to get full, you're looking to have something that's affordable, and you're looking to have something that is fast. And so if all of a sudden you drive up to McDonald's and they were to say, your hamburger cost $120, you'd say, well, wait a minute. McDonald's is not worth $120. Mm-hmm. It's getting there right now, but it's not there yet. And likewise, if you came and they said that'll be an hour and a half to get your Big Mac, you'd be like, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't what I was expecting. Mm-hmm. So if I can have my minimum viable product, which would be just being fed, and then the those items of differentiation, which would be that it's fast and it's affordable, I think I've gotten value. Mm-hmm. And this is how our whole system of economy works is when you have one person that's willing to provide that service or that product, and the other person is willing to give them money for that, you have the person who wants the money is winning and the person who wants the product or service is winning. And so it's really the basis for win-win transactions. And when you hear a win-lose transaction, it's usually like, okay, I thought I was getting something, mm-hmm. and then it ended up being something different, and it didn't offset. The benefits didn't offset what the cost or the hassle was. So I think that's probably a pretty effective definition. I've heard of people try and represent it as a ratio, and mm-hmm. ratio of the benefits received versus the cost of those benefits. I think it's a lot better to include that you have hassle, and then in addition to that you have the price, and that it is a difference of those two.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you are getting something, some mm-hmm. product or service or whatever, and then you take away the price that you've paid as well as whatever you've had to go through to get this.
Exactly. And
whatever you're left over with, we're calling value.
Exactly.
So what happens when the price and the hassle actually outweigh the benefit that you've received? Is there a term for that?
Well, I mean, in terms of a transaction, it would be a losing transaction, but it would be negative returns. It could be, you could have all kinds of mm-hmm. things, but basically it's a bad customer experience.
Okay.
So when we evaluate things, there's a thing called the consumer behavior model where, someone, has some sort of a need that they recognize, and they go through this process of looking for options to satisfy that need, and then looking for vendors who will be able to, provide that particular option, and then they end up with a customer experience. And then at the end of that customer experience, they say, did this meet that need? And if not, they're going to go back up and start the whole process over again. If it did, and it's a recurring need, they're just going to keep doing that. And that's how we actually can create consumer habits. And habits are translated into value propositions for companies that we call brands. So, for instance, McDonald's does have a brand that's based on, you're going to get moderately good tasting food. You're going to get it affordably, and you're going to get it fast. So when someone sees the golden arches, they know exactly what they're expecting, and that's because not only have they experienced that, they've also provided that experience to others. They've told others about it, and so the whole notion, and we see this a lot in terms of like net promoter scores and concepts like that. Is it's this idea that if you provide a good product, you provide a good service, people are going to know about it. They're going to tell their friends and family, and when they tell their friends and family, everybody knows about it, and it grows, and you're now organically developing this brand. And where you see the misses are when all of a sudden you have, well, let's say advertising that says one thing and then delivers something different. And if it's really good advertising or it's a really good salesperson, there's an old adage that the worst thing you can have for a bad product is a good salesperson, because at the end of the day, everybody's going to know that it's a bad product because that salesperson will have gotten a whole bunch of people to try it, and they'll be like, oh, this didn't work. So does that answer that question?
I think so. Yeah. And you've told me before that this, as you believe, is really just kind of the standard conception of value, right? So this is not an idea of value that you came up with yourself.
No, absolutely not. No, this would be, you would find it in textbooks. I will say this, that there's been a modification of what value is, and it's not so much about the benefits and the costs. Well, a little bit about that, but now there's this difference in people trying to redefine what value is, and what they're defining it in is the difference of who is the person who gets to say what value is. And so if you, in the 1980s, 1990s, you started having stakeholder philosophies getting introduced into business practices, and which is a great. You don't want, like, the idea is if you're a chemical production plant and you drop a bunch of chemicals in the river, the next door neighbor's a stakeholder in that. He's definitely affected by what you're doing, and so you should be mindful of what you're doing to those around you. And so this idea of kind of social responsibility started becoming a real thing, and again, some of it started all the way back in the 60s, and now it's kind of morphed into this idea that the stakeholders are determining value, and that they're the ones who should say what's valuable and what's not. And so you have things like that the employees are determining what's value. You have the idea that a plighted, underserved group, a minority group, whatever, that they're all determining value. They're having a say in value, and I think that's pretty errant. I think that you have this well-intended group of individuals, but they're getting away from this really hard, fast truth, and that is that the only person who can define value is the customer. And so the customer is the person. I notice I said customer, not consumer. So the customer is the person that's paying for it. And I think in some scenarios, if the government's willing to pay for something, then they get to define what's value for it, even though the government's supposed to be working for the people. But, if you look at, for instance, issues like prayer in public school and things like that, well, the government's paying for the school, and the government's saying this is what we're willing to pay for, and this is what we're not willing to pay for. And they get to say this is what we're going to value, and this is what we're not going to value. And so when you have a normal consumer, or a normal customer rather, and they're looking at it, if they say, I wanted to buy this and I thought it was going to do this one thing and it did something different, they just won't buy it again. And I think that some of the stakeholder philosophies that we have right now, where you've got minority groups that are totally disinterested in the product that they're trying to affect. They don't have any interest in using the product. But they're going to tell you what you need to have in the product. And this could be also anything from like green initiatives and things like that. You have what we call bundling in marketing, and that is that now if a person wants to buy a car, they're having to purchase a car that has a catalytic converter that can do so much, that it has to do so much in order for it to meet admission standards, or it's, hey, you have to have a certain ESG rating in order to be able to participate in this group. You have to have a certain number of minorities working for you, and all of those things cost money. And so what happens is, eventually it'd be no different than like you have a nice shirt that you're wearing right now. If I was to take that shirt and say, I would probably pay $70 for that shirt. It's a beautiful shirt. Well, if my budget's $70 for the shirt, and then I put gold buttons on it, and now it's a $4,000 shirt because it has, an ounce of gold in the buttons. Okay, well, unless I have $4,000 to spend, I have to say, no to that shirt. And even if I had $4,000 to spend, I might not want to spend it on a shirt with gold buttons.
Yeah.
And so the same thing is happening. And there are good examples of this, where you have entire industries that are catering to certain viewpoints and that have had massively damaging effects on their brand because they didn't understand who their customer was, and they provided a product that did not meet their customer's expectation, or they even disregarded their customers' desires and said, no, we're not interested in you anymore. We want to go and pursue this other customer, and they don't get either. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very misguided thing to ignore the customer because the customer defines value. And, it's I have a real estate broker's license, and with my real estate broker's license, people will ask me how much is their house worth, as if I'm the one determining what that is. I'm not. The only person that can determine what that house is worth is the person who's going to buy it. Mm-hmm. And so that's what, this notion of value, it needs a definition, but then it also needs a participant who is going to enforce that definition. And the only person who can actually establish value is the one that pays the bill. And I think anything that would try and take away from that is just running up against common sense. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, so this idea that the customer is the one who can determine value, that actually follows, it seems, directly from this definition of value, mm-hmm. right? Because you've got the benefit. Well, the benefit to who, right? Yep. The customer. And then you subtract the hassle that they have to go through and the price that they have to pay for it. Now, with that said, though, the customer and the consumer are often the same person, and mm-hmm. even when they're not, there is frequently a very close relationship that exists between those two, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that the consumer's preferences and experience can't be completely ruled out in this equation.
No, not at all. Like we have that, when you look at, there can be multiple customers as well, and there can be multiple consumers, and there's, so you can have a great example would be that you might have a customer who wants to buy a house, and they say, I'm willing to pay $500,000 for that house. And then the bank comes in and says, well, we're not willing to give you a loan for that $500,000 house because we just did an appraisal and we only think it's worth $300,000. Mm-hmm. So now in those situations, what is the, it gets complicated. There's multiple customers. There's the customer themselves. There's the bank who's the customer's wanting the bank's money. And there's this expectation of how much risk is associated with that. And so, we do see that there's always a convolution. There's also a difference, like, in education. Sometimes mom and dad are paying the bill. Sometimes the government is paying the bill. Sometimes, actually that's a misnomer. The government never really pays the bill. They're supposed to give the money to the student who then pays the bill. But the government does put lots of strings and say, mm-hmm. hey, you need to have this ratio of men's sports to women's sports if you're going to take our money, even though it's not their money, it's the student's money. So when you're looking at that, there are all of these people who can put expectations and force that bundling. The question is whether or not the further apart the consumer and the customer are, the more that there's a chance that there's a gap that turns into customer dissatisfaction. Mm-hmm. And so, like, mom and dad may be paying for the school. The student may be, if you ask the student, would you like to come in and get straight A's and never have to go to class? all the students can be like, yeah. Well, that's not really what mom and dad are buying. Mom and dad are buying, we need them to get us an education. We need someone to certify that. We need to get them a network. We need to get them, and ultimately, they want them to have a job.
Mm-hmm.
And so, any of the stuff that prevents the student from getting a job and, just getting a diploma from a diploma mill would, not be a good way for a student to get a job. That's something that's not actually accomplishing what the mom and dad are looking for there, or what the student is looking for, or what the government's looking for, or what, the teachers are willing
Mm-hmm.
to do. I mean, so there does tend to be some sort of a consensus when things work.
So I want to go back to your example of this chemical plant dumping, things in the water. So they're polluting the water of their neighbor, and it could damage their neighbor's livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
But in this world, the neighbor is not a customer, and
Mm-hmm.
so the neighbor doesn't really get factored into this value discussion, it seems. And yet the business, I would think most businesses are trying to maximize value, right? Because that's
Sure.
how they make a return. So with that being said, does it make good business sense for the company to take their neighbor's plight into consideration? And even if it doesn't, like what should be driving this business's thought process? Is it all about value, or is there something else?
Well, it's interesting because the reality is that, there's a separation that's occurred with globalization, where the individuals in the in the past century, the person who owned the business was very interested in the education of the people who were in the community, because they realized that those were going to be the people that were working in their business. And so, I mean, probably the most immediately applicable idea would be like, if I'm a shoe manufacturer and I'm manufacturing shoes in China, and they find out that I'm manufacturing shoes with slave labor and with child labor, suddenly that might cause that manufacturer to be concerned. Okay, well, I don't want people to stop buying my shoes because they're associated with this negative thing that's happening. So there is that type of a constraint. There are also governmental constraints. I mean, look, it's if you just let everybody do what they want, I think you can read through the book of Judges and figure out pretty quickly that when everybody does what they want, they pretty quickly can degenerate into other things. So there's a place for laws, there's a place for order. But again, I think people, when suddenly it becomes that the playing field's not level, when the government says, okay, well, we don't like this industry and we're going to go against it, or we don't like this other industry and we're going to go against it, or we really like this industry and so we're going to support it. What you have to understand is that if you're the person who's in that, who's paying the taxes for that to go on, you can really feel like there's a disservice that your government is doing to you if all of a sudden you're the one who they're trying to put out of business. At the same time, you can see people who could care less what the customer thinks if the government's going to give these massive subsidies, because who's the customer? The government
at that point, right?
And so every time you have these type of disassociations, it's not that you can't have an incentive that works really great for your economy and for consumers and things like that. It's just that, at a certain point, it can become disassociated from the person who's actually desiring and needing a certain amount of value. And if all of a sudden everybody moves to electric cars, well, what we're really saying is only people who can afford electric cars can have transportation that is outside of public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, are we ready to make that move? And do we need to make that move? And, does that move make sense? And why are they not making that move in other places? And so, so there's, I think that all of these well-intended, I'm not questioning the intentions of the individuals who make these rules and who try and play these games. All all of them, I believe, are well-intended. I just think that at a certain point, you can tell when the only real benefit is what the government wants, and then you have a tremendous amount of corruption that's associated with that, because the bureaucracy should not be getting paid as a customer. When you have the government determining what value is, you're taking that decision away from the populace. And being able to determine what value is really causes you to be thankful, and suddenly you're taking things that should be things where you are exchanging value and exchanging your time in a reflection of your money for value. You take those things and you replace them with this notion that the government's supposed to provide this service, or it's an entitlement, and entitlements typically just breed more entitlement. So
okay, so the opportunity to participate in this exchange of value, you're saying, it cultivates the opportunity for thankfulness, whereas eliminating that, and how should we say this? When the consumer is not the one who is also the customer? Is that
no,
where
because
the
the consumer is looking at an exchange for their time and as a reflection of their money, their effort as a reflection of their money. They're trading that money for something, and they're saying, this is what I want, and I think this is going to give me value. Now, it's not that all of those transactions work out perfectly. They don't. I mean, that's why companies go out of business. But when the company does it well, the consumer is happy to do that. And so when all of a sudden the government steps in, what you have is the government trying to define for you what value will be. They're saying, you will get this because you are entitled to this. This is you will get health care because you're entitled to health care. Well, you get what the government says healthcare is because the government's paying for it and the government's going to define it. So if all of a sudden your view of healthcare is, well, I'd like to have an annual MRI to make sure I don't have cancer, and the government says, no, you only get an MRI if we think you have cancer. Well, there's a separation there. The government's the one that gets to say what you get because they're the ones that are then providing it, and it's an entitlement. And what is natural is you say, well, that's not enough. I'd rather have more of this. And they say, well, no, that's not your decision to make. So now you are not thankful for what the government's giving you. You're saying, well, where's the rest of the other things that I should be entitled to? Because I think I'm entitled to annual MRI. And so that's kind of I think the psychology behind why there's an amount of dissatisfaction when things are not provided for by yourself. And likewise, if all of a sudden, everybody wants an annual MRI and somebody goes and invents an MRI machine that does it cheaper, and now they can provide that annual MRI and I want to pay for it and I can pay for that annual MRI, no harm, no foul. It's like, oh, great. Now everybody gets everybody can afford an annual, or if they think that's valuable, they can spend their money on it.
Right.
And so there is and again, I wouldn't. You can find exceptions for everything. You can find that, I don't want this to paint people who say, oh, well, I think it's a great thing that the government should provide health care for its citizenry. I mean, okay, that's fine. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't, and I think that again, it's. I'm not questioning the motives or the morality of the individuals who want to make sure that everybody has health care.
Right, but there's a concern about bundling, right?
Yes, there is.
And minimizing value as a result of that.
Yeah, for me, I don't want to pay for someone to have an abortion. And I'm doing that if I'm paying, the government who's going to be able to then saying, okay, we're going to provide abortions. Like that would be a big issue for me because, I don't believe in abortion.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So the idea of entitlement just made an entrance, and you said that a government will tell you what you're entitled to. Now, that's not typically my interactions with the government. They don't say, Keith Wood, you're entitled to such and such.
No, they call it a right.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you, is how does something become an entitlement in your opinion?
Well, I think that it could just be a consensus. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have a consensus that that's what our government owes us, and that's why we call ourselves Americans, is we believe that we're entitled to life, liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. I think that that notion of self-determination is baked into that concept, and because there's a notion of self-determination, then we, again, who are they saying? It's not the government's definition of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, I mean, it's becoming that, but it's supposed to be our definition. We're the citizenry. The government receives its power from us, and so when you're talking about rights, you're talking about things that actually come from God. We have a consensus that they come from God. There's some monarchs who would say, no, you have no rights. I have all the rights because I was born with all the rights, and therefore you all need to be subjugated underneath me because God gave me all the rights. In our system of government, we don't quite see it that way. We say no, that the government is here to serve the people, and that people are the ones who are given rights individually by God, and therefore our rights are now to be protected and to be cherished, and that right of self-determination is something that's essential to our way of life.
Yeah,
and
I think it's worth mentioning. You're essentially quoting the Declaration of Independence right now, just
in
modern language, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But the people are endowed by their Creator with these rights.
Certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that even the notion of the way that our Constitution is constructed, where the Constitution says, okay, here's what the government's able to do, and anything that we don't delineate that it's able to do, it doesn't have a right to do. I mean, unless there's a consensus by the people to modify that Constitution and add that as a right or a restriction. And so, I think that there's definitely a notion of self-determination that lends itself to a capitalistic society. That's become an evil word now, and if you're on the right, then socialists is an evil word. But I mean, there is this notion of, hey, are we looking at all of the stuff being owned by government and we get to use it, or are we looking at all of the stuff being, we have private ownership, we have the ability to affect we have an ability to own the means of production. And I think that's a controversial thing. Fits within your topic well.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I want to go back a little bit to the definition of value. You've talked about how some groups or individuals have kind of come up with their own formulation of what value is and who it's for, and some of the things that stem from that. But some people are just kind of ignorant. They probably don't think about value in this sort of conceptual way that you're presenting today. So could you motivate for just your average business owner why they should really have a clear idea of value, and maybe what are some of just the everyday misconceptions that occur?
I think, okay, so in marketing we have what's called the 4 Ps, and the 4 Ps would be you're going to affect your product, you're going to affect your promotion, you're going to affect your pricing, and you're going to affect your placement. And what you're really talking about is, to affect your product is the creation of value for someone. To affect your pricing is the exchange of value. To promote is the communication of value, and placement is the delivering of value. And so there's logistical elements there. And so if you're unaware of what the value is that you're creating for your customer, and you're disassociating that value from any one of those areas of either product, pricing, placement, or promotion, then what ends up happening is you'll have a miscue, and the customer will either not align with you, or it's just pure chance that they align with you on what the exchange for that value should be. You may bundle you may bundle extra stuff into the product that causes it to become too expensive, which is the creation of value. Again, if somebody wants to buy a hat and you figure out how to make a better fitting hat, that may be all the value in the world as quickly as you add gold buttons to it. Mm-hmm. Now you've just bundled something that they don't find value in. And then you have on the placement side, if they can't get it, I've used this as an example. Again, a lot of this goes into bundling, but if you look at some of the initiatives that, for instance, Amazon has, nobody cares if you're going to go to an all-electric fleet. Great. That sounds fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you can still get me my product in 2 days. You can't get me my product in 2 days. Wait for, whoever Amazon's competitor is to say, guess what, guys? Walmart just introduced 2-day delivery.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's like, oh, amazing. And guess what? They're still using gas-powered vehicles because they think that delivering in 2 days is more important than sating some sort of a consumer or stakeholder mandate that they should have an all-electric fleet. So all of those things, if you're a business owner, being able to apply value to every area of business is extremely important. And if you miss on any of those, that is going to be where your competitors will have a competitive advantage against you, because whatever that miss is going to represent itself as a weakness. And all that someone has to do is make that their strength, and now they're taking away your customers because they're providing something the customer wanted that you weren't providing, either more affordability, better delivery method, finding out about the product better, and the value of the product better, and then what the product actually does. All of those things are ways that you can lose market share. And so, does that answer that question?
That's a very clear answer. Excellent. Thank you. So we'll shift gears a little bit then. We've kind of been talking about this idea of value in just a broad business sense. But let's talk more specifically from a Christian perspective now. Why is this concept? Is this a concept of value that Christians ought to be aware of? And does it have any implications, maybe even from a theological perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And now, again, I would first preface this that I am not a theologian. I enjoy, I think, the old adage that every man's a theologian. I'd agree with that. I haven't studied as much as most theologians, but it seems very obvious to me that there was a purchase involved in my relationship with Christ. So as a Christian, I believe that Christ, that I was born with a sin problem, that I have a proclivity to do things that are not just damaging to myself, they're damaging to others, they're damaging to the environment with which I live, and that I do not have an ability on my own to rid myself of this sin nature, which is by default corrupting everything that I do. So, the more that I allow that sin to be pervasive in my life, the more corruption, harm, death I create with my decisions. And I think that every one of us is born with that as a problem. And so what Christ and what God did was God said, I need to solve this problem of sin because mankind is valuable to me. It's so valuable that I'm going to allow my son to come to earth and die for this. And so now I think that everybody understands that notion of Christianity. I think where they stop is they don't ask why God would want to do that. And I think it's a very shrewd reason why. I don't think Christ was just this, soulfully magnanimous, sacrificial being who ended up on the short end of the stick. No, I think Christ, our glory, and it's referenced in Scripture, like when we're casting our crowns at Christ's feet. What Christ gets out of the deal is we were not made bad. We were not made corrupted. We became corrupted. And what Christ is doing is he's restoring us to that uncorruptible way that we were originally designed to be. And the reason why he's doing that is because we then have an eternal capacity to do good. So if you took the worst person in the world, if you took an Adolf Hitler, and he did horrible things, well, he did those horrible things for a period of, 60 years. Well, guess what? You can actually have the calculus on that turn out to be a positive if suddenly Adolf Hitler has no desire to do harm to anyone for the rest of eternity. It even makes sense to take someone as bad as that and say, it's not a good deal for them to end up in hell. That's a waste. of an eternal being who could be creating benefit for the entire world. Now, if he's in his normal state, his fallen state, his corrupted state, then the exact opposite works, where he, being left alone and allowed to just spend an eternity doing evil, would be a harm on everyone else. And that's, I think, the reason why we have hell, is to prevent, a commitment to sin from being an eternal commitment to sin. And likewise, the reason why Christ came was he said, this temporal commitment to sin I can fix and give them an eternal capacity to do good. And when you look at it, I mean, like from an environmental perspective, for instance, that's what our job was to tend worlds. We don't have the ability to do that job well right now. The world works against us right now. But there's going to be a time where Christ, because of his death, his sacrifice on the cross, and paying for that, and his resurrection, which then gives us that hope that we're going to be resurrected, causes us to suddenly be able to tend the world better, without sin, without corruption, without causing death and misery and all the different decisions that we make that are selfish decisions. So I view that as a value, a transaction.
Mm-hmm.
Christ paid for temporal sinners to turn them into eternal workers of benevolence. And I think that shows how shrewd Christ was when he did that.
So, there's a couple interesting things there. On the one hand, you're making a case that Jesus was rational in his decision to make this purchase,
Mm-hmm.
right? So he got out of it more than
Absolutely.
than even the hassle of coming to earth and enduring the crucifixion and all those different things. That he counted it worth it, and so it was a good decision for him to do that. But it's also important because if you're right about this conception of the purchase and your definition of value and everything, it says something important about the way that he thinks about human beings
Mm-hmm.
as well, right? And it says something about what we're worth, in a sense. Is that true?
Absolutely. And so, and particularly, we are more like the devil in the way that we view each other than we recognize. So when we're viewing each other, we view each other really in light of our foibles. We compare each other to ourselves. We say, well, I wouldn't have done that, or he didn't do this right, or this is, The way that Christ viewed us was with this post-resurrection, glorified body, eternal being doing good.
Hmm.
And I think if we recognized each other as our future selves, it makes it really easy to fall in love with each other in a way that is exactly what Christ asked, which was for us to first love God and then to love our neighbors. And suddenly we don't look at our neighbor in terms of their foibles. We look at them with this anticipation of how good they're going to be, how worthy they are of Christ's sacrifice. And so why wouldn't they be worthy of our own admiration, since Christ did admire us? And it should cause us, this concept of value and valuing and the way that Christ sees us should cause us to look at each other and be able to see what we're going to be, see the intrinsic value, the inherent value that is being covered up by this sin nature that's temporal. And I think if you do that, I mean, it's very easy to see why God falls in love with us and says, "For God so loved the world," is He's looking at us and saying, "I see what they look like when they're past this mess." Mm-hmm. It'd be like looking at a baby in a dirty diaper. I mean, you don't sit there and say, "Oh, got to get rid of that one." No, you change the diaper, you clean the baby, you adore the baby, you enjoy the baby. It's just the dirty diaper is something you got to get past.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think another thing that follows from what you're saying is that if I look at another person and I say that person ought to be treated in some bad way, right? Or like that.
Yeah.
Not only is it immoral for me to do that, but I'm just not even the right person to be able to say that.
No, absolutely. You're not the one who's making the purchase.
Right.
God made the purchase. So it'd be like me saying, okay, well, that $500,000 house that those people just purchased, it's not really worth $500,000. Well, why would I be able to say that? They just purchased it. Once they purchased it, guess what it's worth? Whatever they paid for it. And so for us to say that that person's not worth God's sacrifice, well, it's not for us to say. Jesus and God were sitting there having a conversation saying, yeah, I think that one's worth the sacrifice. And we're really being very foolish if we sit there and say, no, our estimation of value is better than God's because we haven't made the purchase. Mm-hmm. It's like it'd be like, if I don't, when I go past a Bentley dealership, I go by and I don't think, oh yeah, that's really worth it. Well, guess what? It's worth it to somebody. Right. And the person who buys the Bentley, that's the one that determines the value of the Bentley.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I'm just so fascinated how people in such a variety of disciplines could bring their Christian faith to bear, or can bring their discipline to bear on the Christian faith, and you can kind of see.
I think that it's that truth is universal,
yeah,
and Christ is truth, and so if something works, it's because it's true, and I don't think that business has some sort of a corner on defining, a truth. I think that it's Christ who's defined that truth, and business then gets to take advantage of it and apply it in ways that it's able to treat it as if it's a law. So
yeah, I think that's really wonderful, and I think that also brings us to a perfect stopping point right now. So, Matt, thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate it.
And for those of you who are watching, I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well. I just encourage you, if you have other friends who are curiously minded, please make sure that you share this and be sure to like and subscribe as well. So until next time, take care.